Your credentials are invalid. We don't seat unverified individuals in first class." Captain Margaret Vaughn didn't whisper. She didn't lean in. She projected sharp, loud, and deliberate. Julian Harris had barely crossed the polished threshold of the Gulfstream G700 when her words sliced through the air like a knife. Passengers turned. Some blinked. Others stiffened. But no one spoke. Then came the second blow. Frederick Wells already, lounging in seat. A stood up, snatched Julian's boarding slip without permission, and tore it in half like paper from a notebook. "He's not listed," Frederick declared with smug finality. "He's trying to sneak in." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply knelt and picked up the torn slip, his face unreadable. To everyone else in that cabin, he was just a man in a linen shirt. To Margaret, an inconvenience. To Frederick, an intruder. But what none of them knew, what they were seconds from learning, was that this man owned the entire aircraft, and within 10 minutes, he would dismiss the captain, fire the crew, and ignite a reckoning that would soar far beyond this runway. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Julian Harris remained crouched for a moment, his hand brushing the fragments of his torn boarding pass as though collecting not just paper, but dignity shredded in public view. His posture, graceful, almost meditative, belied the quiet storm building in his chest. The cabin, still filling with passengers, had gone unnaturally quiet. The air didn't move. Neither did the eyes locked onto him. Margaret Vaughn stood tall, arms folded, her uniform perfectly creased, her authority rigid. But it wasn't professionalism that animated her, it was presumption. She saw what she wanted to see: a man who didn't belong. A black man standing alone. No entourage, no expensive briefcase, no suit-screaming status, just a linen shirt, polished shoes, and poise that looked out of place. "I'll need you to step aside immediately," she said, her voice now calm but laced with subtle disdain. "We cannot hold up this flight because someone misunderstood their seat assignment." Julian rose slowly, eyes not on Margaret, but on the window, where the early morning sun illuminated the polished ebony trim of the aircraft interior. It was beautiful, designed that way by his firm, paid for by his name. "I didn't misunderstand anything," he replied, voice low, yet perfectly clear. Frederick chuckled audibly. "You people always think you're above the rules." Julian turned to Himmat. With anger, but with curiosity, like he was studying a species in decline, but he said nothing. Still, his silence said more than rebuttal ever could. Row 3A miles. Turner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at the stranger who had just been humiliated in front of everyone, unsure if he should say something. His hand went to his phone. Grace Patel, seated across the aisle, noticed. She placed a steady hand on his wrist and whispered, "Not yet. Let him decide how this goes." Julian caught the moment, the subtle exchange, the restrained impulse to help, weighed against the fear of making things worse. It was a balance Julian knew well, a lifetime of it. He stepped slightly aside, not out of submission, but of strategy. "I'm requesting verification, not validation," he said quietly. Margaret clicked her tongue. "Chloe, please confirm. Is this man on the manifest Chloe Bennett?" The young flight attendant, with uncertain hands and eyes too quick to dart away, fumbled with the iPad. She tapped, scrolled, then shook her head. "Not listed under 2A," she said. That seat belongs to Mr. Wells. Frederick raised his fake elite card again, grinning. See first class. Verified. Julian's jaw remained still, but his eyes flickered once to the emblem on the card. It was outdated. He knew. He had designed the security overhaul himself, but he said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he gently unfolded the torn boarding slip and held it up. "May I have your attention?" he asked, addressing the entire cabin. Most looked away. Some passengers stared at the floor, but not Caleb Grant, the young journalist in 4C. He raised his pen. Julian continued. "I arrived with a boarding pass issued directly from corporate. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't resisted. I've requested one thing confirmation." Margaret exhaled, frustrated. "You've delayed this flight long enough. Step back, or I'll contact security." Her words hung like smoke. Caleb scribbled quickly. "She's escalating," he murmured. Julian turned to Margaret. "Captain Vaughn, I'm asking you one final time, will you verify this seat with your superior?" Margaret narrowed her eyes. "There is no one superior to me on this flight." Julian blinked. The irony nearly made him laugh. In the back, the woman in 3B leaned to her partner. "Why doesn't he just move seats?" she muttered. "Because it's not about the seat," her partner replied. "It's about being told who he is." Julian glanced at the time. 8:52 a.m. 3 minutes since boarding. 7 minutes left before the first wave would break. He looked to Frederick. "You ripped a boarding pass that wasn't yours. You made an accusation you didn't verify." Why, Frederick shrugged. "Because I can." Chloe's eyes widened. Even she was taken aback by the audacity. Julian nodded once, as if Frederick had confirmed something far larger than a seat assignment. Margaret snapped. "Enough. Chloe, contact terminal staff. Let's prepare for deplaning this gentleman." Julian didn't move. Instead, he turned toward the front of the aircraft, pulled out his phone, and quietly tapped a number. A pause. Then a voice answered. "Yes, sir," said Evelyn Carter. "Calm and ready." Julian didn't explain. He simply said, "Document everything. We're beginning the assessment." "From seat 3A," Miles whispered. "Assessment." Caleb glanced at him. He's not just a passenger. The flight hadn't moved. But something else had. Something in the air. In the posture of passengers. In the growing discomfort of those who had judged too quickly. Julian stood still, poised, not humiliated, but recording. The silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. And in 7 minutes, it would become history. Julian Harris stood calmly in the center aisle, one hand resting lightly by his side, the other holding the remnants of his torn boarding pass. The man who'd just been called unlisted, unverified, and a problem wasn't raising his voice, wasn't arguing, wasn't demanding. He didn't need to, because Julian Harris wasn't just a passenger. He was the reason the jet existed. 10 years ago. Julian had founded Pinnacle Ventures, a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that owned and operated a portfolio of aviation, logistics, and tech subsidiaries including Pinnacle Airlux, the exclusive charter company responsible for this very Gulfstream G700. Every seat, every touchscreen, every thread in the custom upholstery had been signed off by his leadership team. He hadn't purchased a seat on this flight. He owned the entire operation. And yet, none of that mattered to Captain Margaret Vaughn. To her. Julian was a stranger with brown skin, a quiet demeanor, and no visible signs of power. That's all she needed to judge him unworthy. Julian's phone buzzed. Evelyn Carter's voice came through the receiver professional, measured. "Sir, I've initiated time-stamped documentation. The manifest logs show a manual override occurred at 7:12 a. Yeah. This morning, your passenger ID was removed from the primary database." Julian's eyes remained on Margaret, but his voice was low. "Log the override and who initiated it." "Yes, sir," Evelyn replied. "Chloe Bennett." The flight attendant who had been parroting Margaret's orders shifted nervously. She hadn't expected escalation. She definitely hadn't expected the man she was helping eject to make a corporate call mid-aisle without blinking. Margaret, still assuming control, snapped again. "You can make as many calls as you like." "Sir, but your name is not in our system." Julian turned slightly toward her. "Perhaps not, but I assure you, my name is on your paycheck." A few passengers gasped soft. Hushed sounds that broke through the cabin like distant thunder. Caleb Grant, the journalist in 4C, stopped writing. He looked up sharply. Wait, what Miles in 3A leaned over to Grace across the aisle. "Did he just say, 'Shh'?" Grace replied, eyes narrowing. "Let him finish." Margaret blinked. "Excuse me." Julian walked slowly toward the front galley, his movements as smooth and unhurried as ever. "I'm Julian Harris, founder and CEO of Pinnacle Ventures, your company's new parent entity." Frederick scoffed. "Sure you are." Julian glanced toward him. "Mr. Wells," he said, "you presented a fake elite credential badge. The current version was updated in June 2024. The badge you flashed was discontinued in February. Care to explain the discrepancy?" Frederick's smirk faltered just slightly. "I had it grandfathered in." "Did you now?" Julian replied calmly. "Then I suggest you call your grandfather, because that badge isn't recognized by any of our current systems." A ripple passed through the cabin. Nia Thompson, seated quietly near the back, straightened in her seat. Even Chloe began to understand that the man she'd been ordered to dismiss wasn't some random interloper. He was the reason she had a uniform. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "If this is some kind of performance, it's not," Caleb cut in, rising from his seat. "I just Googled him." He turned the screen around. There it was. Julian Harris, CEO and founder. Pinnacle Ventures net worth 4.2 B. Known for investing in equity-forward aviation reform. An audible gasp broke from the passengers. Chloe took a half step back. Frederick sat down slowly. Even Richard Ellis, the first officer standing near the cockpit, suddenly looked pale. Julian walked over to the seat Margaret had denied him. 2A. He didn't sit yet. "I boarded quietly for a reason," he said. "This flight wasn't just transportation. It was an assessment. A human systems test. One I've done before. Quietly. Across all branches of our operations." Margaret didn't speak. Julian continued. "I wanted to know. Announced how our frontline staff treat passengers who don't fit their expectation of wealth." He let that hang. Turns out, I found my answer before the door even closed. Chloe swallowed. Richard looked away. Margaret stood stiffly, arms still crossed. "Power isn't always loud." "Captain Vaughn," Julian said. "Sometimes it listens before it speaks." Then he turned back to his phone. "Evelyn, log this Captain Margaret Vaughn denied boarding to the CEO of the company she reports to. Flight crew supported this denial. A passenger committed credential fraud. Manual override of manifest confirmed." Evelyn's voice returned. Logged and time-stamped. Sir. Julian finally sat in 2A. But this wasn't a retreat. It was a warning shot, and everyone on board knew it now. The hush inside the Gulfstream G700 cabin was no longer uncertainty. It was exposure. Captain Margaret Vaughn didn't blink, didn't flinch, but the set of her jaw was different now. Tighter, less certain. The name Julian Harris had landed like a boulder in the aisle, shattering every assumption she, Chloe, and Frederick had been building their actions on. But Margaret wasn't just shocked. She was cornered. Because this wasn't just one moment of poor judgment. It was part of a deeper rot she'd helped sustain. Julian adjusted his posture in seat 2A, scanning the quiet, gleaming cabin of the aircraft he had personally funded. His fingertips rested lightly on the armrest as Evelyn's voice continued quietly in his ear, audible only to him through the phone. Sir, based on digital traces, the manifest override was processed using a login tied to Richard Ellis's flight crew ID. Timestamp matches 7:12 a.m. The entry removed your name and inserted a placeholder with no assignment. Julian responded evenly. Record that as unauthorized modification. Yes, sir. Chloe Bennett stood beside the galley, still holding the iPad. Her hands trembled now. Her eyes darted toward Richard, who stared at the cockpit bulkhead like it might swallow him. But Julian wasn't done uncovering what lay beneath. He turned to Chloe. Have there been similar overrides before today? Chloe hesitated, then nodded. Yes, a few times, usually flagged as irregular boarding, but Margaret signed off on them. Frederick sat straighter, suddenly uncomfortable with his proximity to the truth. He leaned away slightly, as if trying to escape Julian's voice without moving. Julian kept going. And these overrides, did they happen to involve passengers who didn't look the part? Chloe looked sick. Sometimes. There was a black couple last month denied entry for security misalignment. A Latina entrepreneur who was told her visa documentation was insufficient, even though it had already cleared compliance. 2 thought it was coincidence. It wasn't. Julian replied. It was policy. Not official policy. Margaret snapped from the cockpit door. Don't twist this. Julian turned to face her. I'm not twisting anything. I'm unearthing it. Caleb Grant stood slowly, pulling a folded notebook from his jacket. I've covered discrimination in luxury travel for 5 years, he said. Margaret Vaughn's name has come up in multiple anonymous interviews. Allegations. None with proof. He looked to Julian. Until now. Julian nodded. You'll have your proof by the time we land. Evelyn. Her voice came instantly. Yes, sir. I've requested the audit files. I'm also accessing archived passenger complaints. Some were marked non-urgent, but they were never forwarded to compliance. Chloe blinked. Wait. They weren't forwarded. No, Evelyn confirmed. They were internally suppressed, flagged as resolved, without investigation. Julian looked up at Chloe. And who flagged them? A long silence. Then her whisper. Captain Vaughn. Gasps rippled again through the cabin. Grace Patel, who had remained quiet for much of this exchange, sat up straighter now. She was a lawyer. She knew when negligence became intentional suppression. She buried complaints, Grace said flatly. That's systemic bias. Margaret raised her chin. I followed procedure. I protected flight integrity. Julian's voice dropped lower, colder. You protected an illusion of order built on exclusion. Then he turned to Richard Ellis, who hadn't moved. First Officer Ellis, Julian said evenly. Did you authorize my name's removal from the manifest? Richard hesitated. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. Julian waited. A beat passed, then another. Finally, Richard spoke barely audible. Yes. Chloe dropped the iPad. Frederick muttered a curse under his breath. Why Julian asked. She told me. Richard said. Margaret told me it was a test run, that a VIP manifest adjustment was needed. She said someone was flying as a corporate guest, not official. Julian turned toward Margaret. You misrepresented the identity of your employer. You manipulated your crew. You denied boarding to your superior. All because of what pride, bias, ego. Margaret's mouth curled into something halfway between a smirk and a sneer. I protected my cabin from deception. No, Julian said, rising from his seat. Calm now, only in tone. My intention. You protected it from people who challenged your vision of first class. Caleb Grant flipped to a fresh page in his notebook. This is more than arrogance. This is infrastructure-level exclusion, Miles Turner whispered to Grace. This is happening on every level. The overrides, the blocked complaints. It's not just her. It's a culture. Grace nodded. And it's been carefully curated to seem like policy, when it's really preference. Julian looked around the cabin. I built Pinnacle Airlux to elevate the passenger experience, not filter it. Evelyn's voice returned. Sir, confirmation received. Over 32 complaints in the last 18 months tied to Captain Vaughn's routes were archived without compliance review. Julian didn't flinch. Send the file to internal legal and the FAA. Already in motion. Margaret took one step forward. You won't destroy my career with speculation. Julian locked eyes with her. You destroyed your career with decisions. Silence followed. No one defended her now. The aircraft remained grounded, but the rot had been unearthed, and every person aboard was watching it collapse in real time. The next move would be Julian's. Chloe Bennett stood frozen, the dropped iPad resting on the floor like the shattered trust between her and her profession. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths as the consequences of what she'd participated in knowingly or not sank in. And yet, she wasn't the only one breaking open. Seat 3A Miles Turner, 28 data analyst and avid flyer, looked down at his clenched hands. He'd watched it all, from the moment Julian boarded to the moment his pass was torn. At first, he'd assumed it was a misunderstanding, a mix-up. Something unfortunate, but not malicious. But now he knew better. He reached again for his phone, but not to record. Instead, he opened his notes app and began to type. Slowly, intentionally, a first-person account. Grace Patel turned her full attention to Chloe. Her lawyer's instincts activated. Miss Bennett, she said gently. Did you know who he was before boarding? Chloe shook her head. No, I really didn't. I wasn't told anything about a test flight. Just that if anyone questioned Mr. Wells's seat, I was to affirm his status. Julian's voice was calm. Who told you that Chloe's eyes drifted back to Margaret, who remained at the cockpit threshold? She did. Margaret scoffed. Standard protocol. Protecting high-tier clients. Grace stood slowly, the tone of her voice sharpening with each word. That's not protocol. That's obstruction. And when you instructed your staff to confirm fraud as truth, you made them accomplices, Julian added. And when you silenced complaints about your conduct, you made the company liable. Caleb Grant moved closer. I have enough for a full feature. A cabin discrimination scandal. Cover-up. Abuse of power. Julian held up a hand. Not yet. This story doesn't need to be broken. It needs to be understood. And that's when it happened. Nia Thompson, seated quietly until now. Rose from 3B. She adjusted her scarf, tucked her boarding pass into her purse, and stepped forward with resolve in her step. I have something to say. Everyone turned. I'm Nia Thompson. I'm not a billionaire. I'm not a CEO. I'm a textile designer from Detroit who saved for 8 months to book this flight. My seat 3B was flagged this morning for manual review, even though my documents were perfect. She looked to Julian, and now I know why. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. I've flown economy my whole life. This was my dream flight. But the moment I stepped on board, Margaret Vaughn walked past me 3 times and said nothing, just looked, like she was deciding whether to let me stay. Caleb stepped toward her. Did she say anything on record? No? Nia replied, but her eyes did. And now that I've heard all this, I know I was next. Grace gently reached out and touched Nia's arm. You're not alone, and you're not next. You're part of this now. Nia nodded, swallowing hard. I just want to be seen, not scanned. That moment cracked something open, not just in the passengers, but in Chloe, too. I helped, Chloe whispered. I enabled it. I looked the other way because I wanted to keep my job. Julian turned to her. It's not too late to stand in truth. She stepped forward. There's a notebook. Margaret keeps it in the cockpit. A personal flight log. She writes notes on passengers, codes them. I've seen color tags next to names before. I didn't understand what it meant. Now I do. Margaret's face went pale. Chloe, she said sharply. That's confidential. No. Chloe snapped back for the first time. That's corruption. Richard Ellis, the first officer. Sighed loudly. She's telling the truth. Margaret uses the logbook to track who she thinks is a threat to standards. It's not part of our procedures. It's just hers. Miles stood, heart racing. Then we all knew something and said nothing. We're all guilty. Julian nodded. Guilt isn't the enemy. Silence is. He turned to the rest of the cabin. You were all witnesses. You heard her words. You saw their choices. And now you have one, Caleb whispered. To speak, Grace added. Or stay complicit. Nia finished. I choose to stand. And so did Grace. And then Miles. Then Caleb. One by one, row by row. Passengers rose not with shouts, but with presence. Margaret's eyes darted around, watching her power evaporate like mist in sunlight. Julian faced her. This isn't rebellion. It's recognition. They're not just standing against you. They're standing for what you tried to bury. Margaret turned back toward the cockpit, but the doorway no longer looked like sanctuary. It looked like exile. Julian's voice dropped one final time. This flight won't be defined by your prejudice. It will be remembered for their awakening. And with that, the cabin stood taller than it had ever flown. Julian Harris stood centered in the aisle, surrounded not by chaos but by clarity. Passengers stood in quiet formation. Grace, Nia, Caleb. Miles One had chosen to step forward, not just in protest, but in alignment with something deeper than policy. Truth. Julian turned slowly to Chloe. Where is the logbook? Chloe glanced toward the cockpit, hesitating for a fraction of a second. In the forward compartment, it stored behind the flight checklist, binder hidden behind a latch. Margaret barked. That's private company property. You have no authority. I own the company. Julian interrupted, not even looking at her. and I authorize this search. Chloe moved, careful and deliberate. Her hand still trembled, but her steps were steady now. There was something sacred about the moment, like recovering a buried artifact. Margaret hissed, "This is absurd." Julian's voice didn't rise. "What's absurd is that this aircraft became a test site for your personal agenda." Chloe returned within seconds, holding a slim black leather-bound journal, no more than 100 pages. It looked innocuous, harmless, even. But its weight was felt before it was opened. She handed it to Julian. He flipped it open and immediately saw entries dated across months, some written in neat cursive, others in rushed, jagged shorthand. April 14th, to be African-American male, oversized jacket, possibly off-list. Verify intentions. May 8, 1A female, dark skin, loud earrings, coach vibes. June 2nd, 3B, likely PR bait, avoid interaction. Julian froze. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was calculated discrimination in ink. He turned the book for all to see. Caleb Grant stepped forward and began photographing the pages with his phone. "Don't worry," he said. "These will be time-stamped and uploaded directly to a secure cloud." Julian nodded once. Evelyn. Her voice came crisply through his phone speaker. "Yes, sir. Prepare a digital scan and begin internal verification. This logbook is now evidence. We'll initiate disciplinary proceedings and legal review. Understood. Logging chain of custody and preserving metadata. Do you wish to notify the board?" Julian glanced toward Margaret. She had gone pale. He answered with precision. "Not yet. We'll do this in layers. Let the truth drip. I want every department head to see this before the top floor hears it." Grace Patel stepped closer. "There's something deeper here. A pattern like this doesn't live in isolation. Have complaints been suppressed system-wide?" Julian looked to Evelyn again. "Pull archived complaints flagged as non-critical across the last 24 months for all flights under Captain Vaughn's command. And check for any internal notes attached to Richard Ellis's logins." One moment. A pause. "Sir, 94 entries across 13 flights, nearly all related to customer service escalations concerning race, language, or appearance. Most closed without documentation." Miles Turner exhaled. 94, even Chloe whispered. "I didn't know it was that many. I just saw a few." Julian kept flipping through the logbook. January 4th, 1C Indian accent, insistent on herbal tea, likely dramatic. February 20th, 2D woman, natural hair, refused wine, may be difficult. March 15th, 3A, older black male, retired. Seems quiet. Watch for fake upgrades. Grace stepped forward and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. "This isn't profiling anymore. This is documented bias infrastructure." Margaret didn't deny it. She simply said, "You people have no idea what it takes to keep a flight calm. Sometimes it means separating energy before it flares." Caleb growled. "You mean excluding people before they exist?" Julian looked to Richard Ellis. "Were you aware of this?" Richard's face was blank, stunned, eyes fixed on the journal. "I saw her writing," he muttered, "but I never read it. She said it was just mental notes. I thought, you didn't think." Julian said, "You followed." Chloe Bennett spoke next. "There's more," she said softly. "I didn't know what to do, so I started saving files to a personal folder. I labeled them routine logs, in case someone looked. But they're complaints. Real ones. From real people." Julian's attention sharpened. "Do you have access now?" She nodded. retrieving her tablet from the rear galley. With a few swipes and taps, she pulled up the folder. Pages of testimonies denied beverages, aggressive language, downgraded seats, silent dismissals. "Send them to Evelyn," Julian instructed. Chloe looked at him. "You're not going to fire me. You confessed. You cooperated. You stepped forward." He looked at Margaret. She hid. She commanded. She corrupted. At that moment, a small chime rang from Julian's phone. Evelyn files received. Confirmed. None were ever logged in the central CRM system. This was a full-scale suppression. Julian faced the cabin. "You've all been part of something bigger than a seat dispute. You've just helped uncover one of the most quietly orchestrated discrimination systems in charter aviation," Miles whispered. "Why didn't anyone stop it sooner?" Julian replied, "Because no one dared look until now." The logbook sat on the center tray, open like a wound. Its pages weren't just ink. They were impact. They were proof. They were weight. Julian looked at Caleb. "You said this story doesn't need to be broken." "You're right." He turned toward the passengers. "It needs to be witnessed. And today, they would be the first of millions to do so." Julian Harris didn't react like a man under siege. He moved like a grandmaster. Each step, each breath, each phrase measured. Purposeful. Precise. He stood at the head of the cabin, the black leather logbook open before him like a legal document on trial. Across the aisle, passengers remained on their feet. Longer restrained observers, but active participants in a historic unraveling. Julian turned to Chloe Bennett. "Forward every file in that folder to Evelyn marked with the original timestamps, not the ones from your device. We'll want to compare deletion windows across internal systems." Chloe nodded, then paused. "Should I also include the memos from crew group chat logs?" Julian's brow lifted slightly. "There are memos." "Yes," she said. Voice low. "Crew side chat channels where they'd discuss who looked questionable before boarding. I took screenshots last month. I didn't feel safe then, but I do now." Julian held her gaze. "You were never the problem." Chloe. "But what you do next determines whether you become part of the solution." She nodded again and tapped send. Meanwhile, Richard Ellis had slumped into seat 1C, the sheen of sweat now visible on his forehead. His silence wasn't resistance, it was resignation. Caleb walked by him slowly and whispered, "You could still speak up. Just once. Before this cabin turns into your career obituary." Across the cabin. Grace Patel leaned in towards Julian. "Would you like me to begin drafting legal language? A cease and desist against Margaret's continued command?" Julian shook his head. "Not yet. First let the crew act. Let their character expose itself without interference." Grace raised an eyebrow, but understood. Empathy audit in real time. Exactly. Then Julian turned to Miles. "You said earlier that you work in data systems." "Yes." Miles blinked. "Caught off guard." "Yes. Data modeling and anomaly detection." Julian smiled faintly. "Good. Evelyn will send you a temporary access key. Help us track systemic bias patterns using Chloe's archive." Miles sat up straighter. "Wait. You're pulling me in. I'm empowering the people who actually notice. And you noticed. That means you're qualified." For the first time since the confrontation began, Miles looked proud, not shocked. Julian glanced at his phone again. "Evelyn," he said softly. "What's the current status of the suppression list?" Evelyn's voice returned. 72 additional passengers flagged across 19 past flights. Cross-reference shows a 96% correlation between suppressed complaints and passengers of color. Gasps rose from the cabin. Caleb Grant lowered his notebook. That's not a mistake. That's an algorithm of exclusion. Correct, Julian said. And now we'll reverse engineer it. He walked to the galley, placed the logbook in a sealed plastic sleeve provided by Grace, and slid it into the storage compartment under the service cart. A symbolic gesture evidence placed in plain sight. Just then, the aircraft's intercom crackled to life. Margaret's voice. "This is your captain speaking. Due to internal disruptions and unauthorized data access, I am officially suspending boarding procedures. Airport security has been notified and will remove the disruptive party shortly." The cabin erupted in murmurs. "She's doubling down," Grace muttered. "She's bluffing," Julian said. "The moment she touches that intercom again, she'll trigger an FAA protocol breach." Evelyn confirmed it. "Already done. A formal investigation request has been sent to FAA oversight. Captain Vaughn's communications are now flagged." Chloe stepped forward again, suddenly emboldened. She just overstepped. Pilots aren't allowed to declare passengers unauthorized without compliance verification. Julian turned to her. "Would you be willing to state that on record? I'll say it in court if I have to." Julian smiled faintly. "You won't need to. We'll say it through policy." He walked back toward the front, eyes on Margaret. She stood near the cockpit, intercom mic still in hand, her face flushed with anger. "You think one call makes you a hero?" she hissed. "No," Julian replied. "But one movement can expose 100 failures. Pinnacle Airlux is mine. It was my company before you bought it out. You don't belong in this cabin." Julian didn't blink. "And yeah, there I am, leading a crew that chose silence, surrounded by passengers who now refuse to sit down." A long pause. Then, from the rear of the aircraft, another voice entered the fray. "Excuse me," the voice said. Everyone turned. It was a flight mechanic. Young, brown-skinned, wearing a plain maintenance jacket. He had been silently performing final cabin checks before takeoff. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said, stepping forward. "But I was asked to remove your name from the digital manifest this morning." Julian's eyes narrowed. "By whom?" He pointed to Richard Ellis. Julian turned. Richard looked up, defeated. I told him it was just an internal reset. Margaret said you were flying incognito and needed to be hidden from staff." "Hidden from staff," Julian repeated. "Or hidden from the record." No one answered, but the truth already had. Julian looked back to Evelyn. "Prepare the internal audit rollout. Initiate Phase 1 of Project Clear." Evelyn replied, "Confirmed. Uploading full transparency dossier. Drafting official crew dismissal notice ready when you are." Julian didn't say yes. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward the aisle, facing every passenger, every witness. "We've gathered the evidence," he said. "Now comes the reckoning." The tension in the Gulfstream G700 cabin was no longer a silent current. It was a crackling storm of truth, and Julian Harris, now fully revealed as the CEO and owner of Pinnacle Airlux, stepped forward not with fury, but with force of clarity. He walked calmly toward the cockpit where Captain Margaret Vaughn stood stiff, her grip tight around the intercom mic. Her eyes burned with the last embers of control, but everyone aboard could see it. She'd already lost the room. Julian stopped just short of her. "I gave you every chance, Margaret," he said, voice even, 10 minutes to course correct. 10 minutes to choose integrity. She scoffed. And I gave you 10 years of excellence. This company existed long before your boardrooms showed up and rebranded it with diversity slogans. Julian blinked. Once? You mean accountability? You mean tokenism? She snapped. Let's stop pretending. That was it. The cabin gaspedone collective exhale as Margaret's mask shattered in one line. No more coded language, no more plausible deniability, just raw, open disdain. Caleb stepped into the aisle. You just admitted it. Grace Patel nodded grimly. On record. With intent, with impact. Julian didn't need to react. The words had done the work for him. He simply reached into his blazer, pulled out his phone, and tapped once. Evelyn's voice came instantly. Recording logged. Escalation protocol now eligible. Julian turned to Richard Ellis, who had stayed seated but no longer tried to hide. You've been silent too long. Speak. Now. Richard's voice shook. I followed her lead. I didn't question because she said it was necessary. That you were conducting internal exposure tests to trap us. Julian's brow furrowed. Trap you, he repeated. Or reveal you. There's a difference. Chloe stepped forward. She manipulated all of us. She used your status as a shield for her prejudice. Told us we were protecting flight integrity, when really we were protecting her ego. Margaret spun toward her. You ungrateful child. Julian raised a hand. Enough. His voice cut through the cabin like a blade. You've accused me of deception, fraud. You've allowed passengers to be humiliated, ejected, flagged, silenced, and now, when the mirror is turned back on you, you call it entrapment. She turned away. I did what I had to. No, Julian said, stepping closer. You did what you wanted, and you expected silence in return. That's when the final blow came. From the back of the cabin, Miles Turner called out. Sir, we found another logbook. Digital. Chloe's file backup just revealed a cloud-linked document with dozens of additional notes. Names, seat changes, notes like less visible and diversion priority. Julian's jaw tightened. Send to Evelyn. Immediately. Caleb leaned in, stunned. She didn't just document bias. She engineered passenger flow based on race. Julian turned to the rest of the cabin. This isn't about poor judgment. It's about structural manipulation. And I will not let it fly. He looked back at Margaret. Captain Vaughn, I am now exercising my executive authority as CEO of Pinnacle Ventures and owner of this aircraft. You are hereby, I am the ranking officer on this jet. She roared. Not anymore. Julian took another step. You are dismissed. Effective immediately. From command. From crew. From all current and future employment under Pinnacle Airlux. Silence. Then a seatbelt clicked. Grace stood up fully. I second the dismissal, as a representative witness. Caleb raised his voice. And as a journalist, I verify the exchange was public, documented, and uninterrupted. Margaret stood frozen, trembling, not in fear, but in rage. You think this ends me, she whispered. Julian's voice was soft. No, you ended yourself. I'm just letting the world catch up. Then he turned to Richard. You're next. Richard rose slowly. Before you do, I want to say something. Julian folded his arms. Then say it. I was wrong. I knew she had a problem with race. I saw it. I ignored it. I thought, if I just followed protocol, I wouldn't be complicit. He looked around. But silence is complicity. And if you fire me, I accept it. But let it be with the truth said aloud. Julian paused. You'll be held accountable, but your words today will be part of your record. Evelyn logged and documented. Julian turned back to the aisle. Chloe Bennett, your confession came at personal risk, but participation is still participation. You are hereby suspended pending full review. She nodded tearfully. Thank you for the chance to say it. Then Julian looked to the passengers. This is no longer about my seat. This is about every traveler who's ever been told they don't belong, every complaint that was buried, every nod that said, play along when the price was your dignity. He took a breath. And now, the cleanup begins. Julian Harris stood at the center of the aisle, his presence a gravity that now bent the entire aircraft's energy around him. Margaret Vaughn was no longer the captain of the Gulfstream G700, not in title, not in perception, and certainly not in control. The structure she once commanded had crumbled, but the fall wasn't just hers. It was the system collapsing known truth at a time. Passengers remained standing. Chloe had stepped back into the galley, her head bowed. Richard Ellis returned to his seat, breathing heavy like the confession had drained his last ounce of defense. And Margaret. She stood frozen at the threshold of the cockpit, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles went white. Julian turned toward the rear of the cabin. Evelyn, he said into his phone, initiate the next phase. Activate full disclosure protocol. Send compiled logs and suppressed reports to Pinnacle Ventures Legal, FAA Oversight, and Civil Aviation Transparency Alliance. Evelyn's voice came sharp and immediate. Confirmed. Dispatching encrypted files to all stakeholders. Notifications will hit executive inboxes within 90 seconds. Grace Patel, arms crossed and jaw tight, stepped forward. I'm adding my legal affidavit to that file. What we've witnessed here today isn't just discriminatory, it's institutional dereliction of ethical duty. Julian nodded. You're doing more than witnessing. You're rewriting the policy. The jet's ambient hum was all that remained of its once polished calm. That was, until Miles spoke up again from mid-cabin. Sir, the secondary folder from Chloe's cloud account just updated. It includes passenger seat switching algorithms applied manually over the last 6 months. Guess who initiated them? He didn't wait for a reply. Captain Vaughn. Every time. Julian inhaled once, deeply, then looked at Margaret. You didn't just violate standards. You violated the very reason this company exists. She shook her head slowly. This isn't about race. It's about preserving luxury. Julian's tone hardened. Luxury built on exclusion is just segregation wrapped in silk. And now, the room began to speak. Passenger 5A, an older Korean-American businessman, raised his hand. I flew this route 3 months ago, was downgraded last minute, and told the manifest changed. I didn't complain, but I knew. In 4D, a Nigerian doctor named Oluchi stood. I was denied boarding last year on a weather excuse. The flight left 20 minutes later. In 3C, a young indigenous woman spoke up. I received a survey post-flight asking if I felt aligned with first-class standards. I didn't understand what that meant. Now I do. One voice after another. Story after story. Like embers, each revelation sparked new flames of recognition and then rage. Julian turned to face them all. This was never just Margaret Vaughn's flaw. She became the face of a failure the system allowed. But now the mirrors turned, and none of this can be hidden again. Caleb Grant, furiously writing, looked up. You know this will go viral, right? This isn't just a policy story. It's a reckoning, a cultural one. Julian nodded. Let it. That's when Evelyn returned with a new update. Sir, FAA has confirmed receipt. Internal audit files are under preliminary review. You have been authorized to issue a conditional suspension of flight operations pending crew reassignment. The cabin let out a collective breath. Even those who had said nothing until now felt the weight shift. The floor beneath them, once held up by silent complicity, now stood on integrity. Julian looked to the rear, where a secondary crew member, a standby pilot, Captain Renee Walters, stood quietly, watching everything unfold. He addressed her. Captain Walters, do you have credentials available? She nodded. Yes, sir. Fully certified. Cleared for this aircraft class. Julian looked at Evelyn's screen. Confirmed. Records are clean. Prior flights show no internal or external complaints. Background aligns with Pinnacle ethical training protocols. Julian turned back to the stunned cabin. Then, effective immediately. Captain Renee Walters will assume command of this flight. Margaret's mouth fell open. You can't. I just did. Julian pointed toward the exit hatch. Margaret Vaughn, you are to leave this aircraft immediately. Your badge, your flight authority, and your operational access are all revoked. She didn't move, so Julian took one step closer and whispered, not with anger, but with conviction. You built a house of bias on my runway, and I just leveled it. Margaret's hand shook as she reached into her jacket and pulled out her pilot badge. She dropped it on the floor. No one applauded. No one jeered. They just watched as she turned, walked down the aisle, and disappeared into the boarding tunnel without a word. Julian turned to Chloe. You're next to exit. She nodded. I understand. As she moved toward the rear, she passed by Naya, who looked her in the eye not with hate, but with disappointment. And that was worse. Richard Ellis stood slowly. I'll leave too. Julian turned toward him. You'll face a formal review, but thank you for finally speaking. As Richard exited, the door closed behind him with a soft mechanical whir. Julian looked to the new pilot. Captain Walters, please ready the flight for delayed takeoff. Yes, sir, she replied, stepping into the cockpit with quiet dignity. Julian exhaled, not from exhaustion, but from release. The rot had been exposed. The weight had shifted. And for the first time all morning, the jet felt ready to fly. The cabin, once stiff with discomfort and hierarchy, had undergone a complete transformation. It no longer belonged to the silence of complicity or the authority of uniforms. It breathed now with truth, and with something rarer in luxury aviation humility. Captain Renee Walters emerged from the cockpit in full command uniform. Her voice over the intercom was calm and professional, but there was something in her tone-measured resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Renee Walters. I have assumed command of Flight LX-713 under executive order. We'll be grounded temporarily while a new crew completes pre-departure checks. We appreciate your patience and your voice. The last 3 words weren't protocol. They were recognition. Passengers glanced around the cabin, unsure if they should sit again. Some remained standing. Others moved slowly back into their seats, not out of deference, but in solidarity. Julian remained on his feet. He walked the length of the cabin, not as a CEO patrolling his assets, but as a witness to what had survived. At 3B, Nia Thompson wiped her cheeks. Her dream flight had become a battleground. But in this new quiet, she felt something better than comfort acknowledgement. Julian paused beside her. "You still have a destination. Miss Thompson." She looked up, her voice gentle. "I know, but I feel like I already arrived somewhere more important." He gave a soft nod and continued walking. At 4C, Caleb Grant finally set his notebook aside. He wasn't writing now. He was watching. "You know this will change things," he said to Julian as he passed. Julian didn't stop. "It won't change everything, but it starts something." A few seats down, Grace Patel caught his gaze. "I've worked civil rights law for 20 years, she said. "I've seen people sue airlines. I've even helped them win. But I've never seen a CEO take responsibility mid-air." Julian gave a half smile. "I wasn't supposed to take this flight." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here?" He looked toward the front of the cabin, where the sunlight spilled in through the half-open door, because someone needed to see if the system we built could stand without supervision. She understood immediately, and Julian's expression shifted somewhere between pain and purpose. It didn't. "So now we rebuild." Captain Walters returned from the cockpit, signaling to Julian discreetly. He stepped toward her. "Secondary crew en route. Estimated 15 minutes. She reported. "Fuel status green. Flight plan approved." Julian nodded. "Excellent. Thank you. Captain?" She hesitated a moment before adding, "I've watched this company from the outside for years. I never thought the culture would allow for this level of accountability." "It didn't," Julian replied. "Until now." As she returned to finalize protocols, Julian made his way back to seat 2 at the same one Frederick had once claimed with arrogance and fraud. It sat empty now, not just physically, but symbolically. He sat down, slowly, with intention. And then he opened his phone not to speak to Evelyn, not to trigger another protocol, but to write. He tapped out the beginning of a company-wide message. Something real. Something unfiltered. To every member of Pinnacle Ventures and Pinnacle Air Lux. Today, I boarded a flight unannounced. I was denied my seat, my name removed, my presence questioned. But what happened next wasn't just a confrontation, it was a revelation. We failed our passengers not with one mistake, but with a culture that allowed many to go unchecked. That ends now, effective immediately. We will audit, reform, and restructure not just our training, but our values. We will listen harder, respond faster, and protect dignity, not just luxury. He paused, then added one last line. Because we don't just fly to move people, we fly to elevate them. He pressed save, not send, not yet. The passengers around him had returned to their seats. Caleb resumed writing. Grace began reviewing FAA policy on discrimination protocols. Nia leaned her head against the window, eyes closed, but lips softly smiling. Miles scrolled through his data logs, refining pattern detection tools already invested in being part of the fix. The cabin no longer felt like a luxury showroom. It felt like the first chapter of something new. Outside the window, a ground vehicle approached, carrying the incoming staff. The new crew. Inside the aircraft. Nothing physically had changed. And yet, everything had. Because power had shifted not just from one captain to another, but from silence to speech, from permission to participation, from image to impact. Julian exhaled. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't justice with volume. It was justice with structure. And it was only just beginning. By the time the new crew stepped onto the tarmac, the cabin had transitioned from confrontation to coordination, But in the boardrooms above the skies, the real turbulence was just beginning. Julian's messages saved but not yet sent was already being drafted into formal policy. But before public statements came corporate reckoning. He tapped his phone again. "Evelyn," he said calmly, "initiate internal review notifications. Deliver the following reports with attached audio logs, manifest edits, and Chloe's file package to Human Resources, Legal, and Operations Division Chiefs." Her response was crisp. "Files in transit. Confirmation expected within 10 minutes. Compliance Review Team has already flagged Margaret Vaughn's case as high priority red zone." Good. "And the Flight Operations roster Richard Ellis suspended pending formal hearing. Chloe Bennett suspended with confession logged. Eligible for retraining. Margaret Vaughn termination processed. FAA license review triggered." Julian exhaled. "Notify the PR crisis team to prepare language for media release. No spin, just facts." Evelyn's tone shifted. "That's going to rattle shareholders." "Let it," Julian replied. "Truth doesn't require consensus." Across the aisle, Caleb was already typing. "You've got half a dozen passengers on this plane who will speak to the press the moment we land." Julian didn't look over. "Let them. In fact, I want their statements unfiltered." Caleb's eyebrows rose. "Seriously, you've seen what curated statements do. They neutralize impact. We need raw testimony. Voices, not varnish." He stood again and walked back to Grace, who had begun assembling documents on her tablet. "Legal recommendations," he asked. Grace didn't look up. 2. First, fast-track Chloe's logs and file a full pattern discrimination report to both the FAA and U.S. Department of Transportation. Second, subpoena access to the archived flight audit logs from before your acquisition. Julian nodded. "And the logbook." Grace lifted it in its plastic sleeve. "I'm submitting it to evidence." "But Julianne, this is going to trigger a cascade. Pilots, staff, even rival charter companies. If this logbook goes public, the floodgates open. I know. From the cockpit." Captain Renee Walters returned with an update. "Cabin is cleared, new crew is verified, and fuel is secured. We're clear for pushback when ready." Julian nodded. "Hold for 5 more minutes. I'm finishing this." Then he walked to the front of the aircraft, turned to face the passengers, and for the first time, formally addressed them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice strong but grounded. "Thank you for your patience, your courage, and your integrity." Every pair of eyes turned toward him. Today wasn't supposed to be this kind of flight. This was meant to be an internal audit, anonymous, quiet, data-driven. But what we encountered wasn't a blip in protocol. It was a culture. He took a breath. A culture that let prejudice wrap itself in professionalism. A culture that kept logbooks for bias but filed none for truth. A culture that weaponized uniforms and comfort against passengers who dared not look a certain way. Miles Turner, eyes wide, nodded slowly. "He's right. I always thought it was me. That maybe I was imagining it." Julian heard him. "You weren't imagining it, Mr. Turner, and you weren't alone." He continued. 3 crew members have been dismissed, 1 permanently, 2 pending review. Their actions today were not isolated, and we will prove it. As of now, Pinnacle Airlux is entering a 30-day structural review across all flight operations. Every manifest, complaint, override, and survey will be reopened. Nothing will remain sealed. Gasps rippled through the passengers. Even Caleb stopped writing. This includes suspensions for any employee who fails to disclose prior misconduct. Every route flown under Captain Vaughn's command is now flagged for cross-review. Julian reached into his jacket and retrieved a printed sheet one he had drafted weeks ago in anticipation of future reform. He held it up. This is the foundation for a new program. The Pinnacle Transparency ACTA Reform Initiative, mandating third-party audits, anonymous crew evaluations, and mandatory video logs for all premium flights. No exceptions. The cabin burst into low murmurs of approval. Julian walked down the aisle, passing each passenger like a conductor finalizing his symphony. To the passengers here, you're now the first to witness reform, not from a press release, but from a seat. Your voices will be part of the historical record. You're all being invited to join the Pinnacle Advisory Council Real Feedback. Real faces. Real reform. Grace stood beside him now. I'll provide pro bono legal support to every passenger who wishes to submit a statement, Caleb added. And I'll provide media shielding until they're ready to speak. Julian stopped near 3B. Nia looked up at him again, this time, not with trembling confusion, but with quiet pride. You still want to go to London? He asked. She smiled, more than ever. He turned toward the front. Captain Walters, we're ready to fly. Renee's voice rang out cabin secure. Flight path clear. Engines primed. The aircraft, grounded for nearly 2 hours, began to hum with energy again. But it wasn't the same plane anymore. It was a vessel of reckoning and rebirth. The jet engines of the Gulfstream G700 hummed to life as the aircraft taxied away from the terminal. But inside the cabin, another current surged forwards, one that had nothing to do with turbines or fuel. Power had changed hands. No longer was authority determined by uniforms or mic access. No longer did titles shield accountability. For the first time, the passengers aboard this aircraft witnessed something rare, a full reversal of power from those who abused it to those who'd silently endured it. Julian Harris sat in seat 2A, the same one Frederick Wells had once claimed as his territory. Now, Frederick was gone. So was Margaret. So was Richard. So was Chloe. And every inch of the cabin felt lighter for it. Captain Renee Walters's voice came calmly over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now been cleared for takeoff. This flight will resume shortly. Thank you for your patience and participation in helping make this aircraft and this company better. There was no fanfare in her voice, no flourish, just steadiness, competence, the kind of authority that had nothing to prove. Julian looked around. In seat 3A, Miles Turner now sat upright with his laptop open. His data visualizations had become an impromptu in-flight dashboard showing the relationships between suppressed complaints, race-coded entries in Margaret's logbook, and flight route anomalies. Grace was helping him annotate the entries for legal clarity. In 4C, Caleb Grant had finally stopped scribbling. He wasn't reporting anymore. He was watching. We've crossed into something different, he whispered to himself. This isn't an article. This is a blueprint. Next to him, Nia Thompson leaned forward. You're going to write about it, right? He nodded. But not just the abuse. I want people to see the repair. Julian smiled as he overheard them. That's what this was about. Because what had begun as a personal Teston anonymous audit had now evolved into a live demonstration of power reframed. And it wasn't just Julian's power. That was the point. It was Chloe, choosing to speak, even when it cost her position. It was Richard, admitting complicity in front of dozens. It was Nia, standing in the aisle and daring to ask, "Do I belong?" It was Grace, offering legal muscle not for profit, but for principle. And now, it was the passengers, silent no more, who held the final say on what the company must become. Julian tapped Evelyn's contact again. "Yes, sir," she answered instantly. "Upload version 2 of the Pinnacle Unity Initiative. Include the advisory council structure, legal frameworks Grace just sent, and Miles's dashboard. Already in progress. Would you like me to notify the board?" "Not yet," Julian said. "Let the cabin see it first. Let them co-author it." From behind him, a passenger spoke for the first time since takeoff. It was the older Korean-American man from seat 5A. He rose carefully and adjusted his collar. "I've flown private for 18 years, he said, voice gentle but firm. "I've seen every kind of exclusion wrapped in politeness. No one ever challenged it, not like this." Julian stood with him. "Would you be willing to review the new equity training module when it's drafted?" The man blinked. Then he smiled. "I'd be honored." 2 seats away, a Latina executive raised her hand. "I'd like to help write the passenger experience manual," she said, "but not the one for brochures, the one that trains flight staff on what not to assume." Julian nodded. "Done." Another passenger, a Sikh physician, raised his voice. "I'll fund 3 scholarships to train diverse pilots. My father wanted to fly, but he was told he didn't look the part." Julian turned, stunned. "That's generous. It's necessary," the man replied. Just then, Evelyn's voice returned. "Sir, early media pings are surfacing. Passengers are live blogging and uploading anonymized statements. But here's the surprising part." Julian waited. "They're praising the company, not just you. Your silence during the first half, it gave them space to rise." Julian looked around the cabin again. He saw people who had walked in as strangers and were now co-authors of something monumental. "That was the plan all along," he said. "You didn't plan for this, sir?" Julian smiled. "No, but I planned for what this could become." The cockpit light turned green. Captain Walters gave a thumbs up from the front. Takeoff clearance was granted. Julian picked up the intercom handset. He didn't need to speak long. He just said, "This flight is now a collaboration, and every voice that stood today is part of its new direction." Then he paused and added, "Welcome aboard the first flight of the future." As the jet lifted gently from the runway, the cabin stayed still, not silent, not tense, but steady. They were all flying forward together. As the Gulfstream G700 lifted into the sky, something rarer than altitude had been achieved: trust. For the first time in Pinnacle Air Lux's short but troubled history, its passengers weren't just along for the ride. They were shaping the route. Julian Harris looked out the window briefly. The clouds below them stretched in soft ridges. The jet cruised at 36,000 feet. But his mind was grounded in boardrooms, in hangars, in lounges where injustice wore tailored uniforms and lanyards with fake smiles. He stood. The moment called for a pivot. Not a press release, not an apology tour. Something deeper, structural. He walked to the front of the cabin, where Captain Renee Walters stepped out of the cockpit. "You've stabilized more than just this flight," he told her. She straightened. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job." "No," Julian replied. "You did more. You proved that real leadership doesn't shout at shows." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver pins leak, modern, embossed with the Pinnacle Air Lux insignia. "I've only given 2 of these," he said. "One went to the former chief of operations. This is the third. She hesitated. Sir. Julian shook his head. This isn't a promotion. It's a prototype. You're going to help design the leadership framework from the flight crew level upward. Training, accountability, mentorship. Not just checklists, but ethics. Renee took the pin carefully. Her voice shook just slightly. You're rebuilding the command chain, she said. No, Julian answered. We are. Just behind them. Grace Patel and Caleb Grant watched the exchange. She's the first, Grace whispered. Caleb nodded. First of many. Julian turned to the passengers. Effective immediately, he said. Renee Walters is no longer just the relief captain for Flight LX-713. She's now acting director of ethical operations for Pinnacle Air Lux reporting, directly to me. Gasps broke out. Not from shock, but from relief. This isn't a symbolic role, Julian continued. She'll have hiring power, training oversight, and a direct vote in all disciplinary boards, and she won't be the last. He turned to seat 3A. Miles Turner. Miles looked up, surprised. Yes, you spotted the anomaly in the badge format before anyone else. You saw what others ignored. That's not just data instinct. That's human pattern recognition. I want you to join the Data Ethics Advisory Team. Temporary contract. You'll work with Evelyn and Grace to build our predictive discrimination audit model. Miles's jaw dropped. I analyze spreadsheets for insurance claims, and now you'll analyze prejudice and help dismantle it, Miles whispered. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Julian looked around. In this cabin, we witnessed the failure of traditional hierarchy. We saw what happens when authority goes unexamined. But more importantly, we saw what leadership can be when it's rebuilt from the inside out. He gestured toward the galley. Every crew member going forward will undergo a new vetting process, not just based on technical proficiency, but on interpersonal integrity. If you lead a cabin, you must first learn to serve it. He turned to the passengers again. I'd like to invite 4 of you to form the first Passenger Equity Roundtable. You'll advise us on live experiences, reaction policies, and engagement protocols. Hands went up. Nia Thompson, the Sikh doctor. The Korean-American businessman, and a Latina executive who'd stayed quiet until now. I've trained DEI teams in the energy sector, she said. I'll bring frameworks. Julian smiled. Then your hired consulting capacity. Caleb leaned toward Grace. This isn't a speech. This is a transition of power. She nodded. And for once, it's not happening behind a door. Julian looked towards the cockpit again. Captain Walters, inform the Fleet Operations Desk that command transition is complete. We are flying under the first official initiative of the Pinnacle Reform Directive. Yes, sir. Julian opened his phone and, without hesitation, tapped send on the message he had drafted hours earlier. In one moment, a cabin became a boardroom, and a boardroom became a shared vision. The message landed in inboxes across 5 continents: executives, crews, partners, clients, journalists. It read, Today, a captain was removed mid-flight, not because of politics, but because of principle, because luxury that tolerates injustice is no luxury at all. We will rebuild Pinnacle Air Lux from the tarmac up with ethics, with equity, and with you. At that moment, a soft chime sounded. Evelyn's voice returned. Sir, initial reactions from board members are in: 12 endorsements, 4 abstentions, 1 resignation. Julian asked. Who resigned? COO Henry Bramwell. He cited philosophical misalignment. Julian exhaled. Accept it. Then contact HR. Begin vetting internal leadership candidates who represent the future we saw today. Grace looked at him. And what do you call this chapter? Mr. Harris. Julian turned to her. New leadership. Then he looked out the window again. Not at clouds this time, but toward the invisible jet stream that marked where institutions either soared or fell, and he knew they were finally flying forward. From 36,000 feet above the earth, Julian Harris wasn't looking down. He was looking forward, and what lay ahead was not just another leg of a flight. It was the beginning of the most ambitious cultural overhaul in Pinnacle Air Lux's history. The cabin had quieted, but it wasn't the hush of avoidance. It was attention-focused, alert, expectant. The passengers who had once been treated as bystanders were now co-architects of a company's transformation. Julian stood at the front of the aisle and tapped his phone again. "Evelyn," he said, "initiate the rollout of the Pinnacle Reform Directive Phase 1. Her voice responded without hesitation. Confirmed. Delivering internal memos, legal framework, and leadership advisory structure. Uploading new documentation to HR, legal, and crew services portals now." Julian turned to the passengers. "Let me walk you through what happens next." He wasn't speaking as a CEO now. He was speaking as a reformer. "First," he said, "all Pinnacle flight crew will undergo immediate empathetic leadership training. Not optional, not symbolic. Every pilot, attendant, and ground agent will pass new situational awareness modules designed by a rotating panel of passengers, some of you included." Heads turned. "That training," he continued, "will be rooted in real case files like the ones Chloe Bennett archived. It won't be written by lawyers. It'll be written by witnesses." Grace Patel lifted her tablet. "I've begun compiling a legal blueprint. I've named it the Passenger Protection Accord. We'll mandate mandatory grievance reviews, no expiration date, and no suppression threshold." Julian nodded. "Attach it to the Pinnacle Code of Ethics. Make it an operating policy, not a suggestion." Evelyn chimed in. "Policy added to governance queue. Legal routing in progress." "Second," Julian said, "we're creating a digital portal, the Pinnacle Voice Network." He turned to Caleb. "This is where you come in." Caleb sat forward. "You want me to design it? I want you to curate it. A place where passengers can anonymously share stories, experiences, and ideas without filters. Think of it like Yelp meets a whistleblower hotline, but smarter and human." Caleb grinned. "Done." Julian looked toward Miles Turner. "You'll build the bias detection layer. Use your models to flag recurring red flag incidents in flight logs, behavior patterns, and complaint language." Miles replied, "Already typing. I'll create a predictive pattern tree. We'll catch the problems before they repeat." Third, Julian said, "We will recertify every cabin leader not just by flight hours, but by trust reviews. They'll need to pass peer-reviewed empathy audits, not just checklist drills." Captain Renee Walters stepped out from the cockpit again. "Does that apply to new hires too?" Julian nodded. "Especially them." She smiled. "Then I want to help write the hiring playbook." "You will." Fourth, Julian said, voice tightening. "We're introducing the Cabin Justice Clause, effective immediately. No crew member can override a passenger's verified credentials without a second-tier verification from Operations Command. No more lone decisions. No more secret blacklists. And all overrides will be stored permanently in cloud review logs." Murmurs of affirmation swept through the cabin, Grace added. "That alone would have prevented what happened to you today." Julian nodded solemnly. Fifth, he said, we're launching the Pinnacle Sky Trust, $15 million in initial funding, purpose diversify leadership pipelines, increase access to pilot scholarships, train new HR mediators, and fund equity-based reform. Nia Thompson raised her hand from 3B. How will you make sure it's not just another PR move? Julian looked her in the eye. Because you'll sit on the board of the trust. Her lips parted in shock. You represent every traveler who's ever wondered if they had to shrink to fit into a first-class seat. I want you in the room where decisions are made. She swallowed, deeply moved. Then I'll be there. Not for me. For the next girl who walks down that jetway. A quiet ripple of emotion moved through the passengers. Julian continued. And finally, he said, voice calm but unshakable, we are opening Pinnacle's doors to external audit. Every 6 months, we will bring in civil rights observers, community leaders, and social ethics professionals. They will audit our procedures and publish the results publicly. No hiding, no exceptions. Even Evelyn was stunned. Sir, that level of exposure will trigger media reaction, possibly shareholder resistance. Julian didn't flinch. If our shareholders don't believe in justice, they can sell, Caleb whispered to Grace. He's not just cleaning house. He's rebuilding the foundation. Grace nodded, and finally letting sunlight in. Captain Renee stepped forward. I've flown under many owners, but this is the first time the view inside the cabin looks better than the view outside the window. Julian turned one last time to the passengers. This is no longer just a luxury airline. This is a values carrier. And starting today, our flight plan includes justice. 37,000 feet in the air. A revolution was already trending. Julian Harris didn't know it yet, but while Pinnacle Airlux's flagship Gulfstream soared eastbound over the Atlantic, millions of eyes were looking up not to the sky, but to their screens. Across social media platforms, hashtags like Seat4Justice, Pinnacle Reform, and Who Owns the Jet erupted within hours. It started with a single video Miles Turner's reluctant recording, shared with context by Caleb Grant. The clip didn't show shouting or violence. It showed something far more powerful, a man calmly being denied his rightful seat, and then reclaiming not just the seat, but the entire aircraft. The caption was simple. They said he didn't belong. 10 minutes later, he fired the captain. Watch what happens when silent dignity meets systemic bias at 35,000 feet. It was retweeted 600,000 times in the first 2 hours. Then came Grace's live Q&A on LinkedIn Live, where she explained how real-time evidence, legal frameworks, and a room full of unlikely allies changed the trajectory of a company in one flight. Justice didn't come from outrage, she said. It came from organization. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter was overseeing a storm of inbound communication from the Pinnacle Ventures crisis server, but for the first time in years, they weren't damage reports. They were endorsements. Dear Mr. Harris. One message read, I've flown your airline twice. I always noticed something off in first class, but I never had proof. What you did today gave voice to what many of us quietly felt. Thank you. Another came from a teacher in Tulsa. My students are watching the footage. I showed them your cabin speech instead of a lecture on civic duty. They understood it better than anything I could have taught. Evelyn forwarded the messages in batches. Public sentiment index is 91% favorable, she told Julian. Even corporate partners are reaching out. 3 airlines have requested joint reform workshops. Julian smiled faintly. Change is contagious when it's real. In the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. No one was watching in-flight movies or sipping quietly from their wine glasses. They were talking, sharing stories. An older woman in 4A described how she'd once been pulled aside in another private terminal and interrogated about her ID because it didn't match her outfit. A biracial teenage boy seated near the galley said he'd flown first class once with his father and was asked by crew members to please don't touch the champagne settings. Everyone had a version of the story, but now they had a language for it, and more importantly, they had a leader who listened. Julian rose again and walked to the center of the cabin. "Evelyn," he said over the call, "I'm going to let the public in. How, Sir Live Feed. Let them watch what reform feels like, not in a boardroom, but in the aisle." Evelyn paused. Streaming link initiated. Channel encrypted, but viewable to the public. You're live in 5, 4, 3. Julian turned the camera toward himself. This is Julian Harris, CEO of Pinnacle Ventures and Pinnacle Airlux. Today, I boarded a plane unannounced. Within minutes, I was treated as an intruder, my name removed from the manifest, and my seat denied. He paused, not for drama, but for breath. But I'm not here to shame. I'm here to share. What happened after that wasn't just about me. It was about us. Because a plane isn't just wings and wheels. It's a space, a temporary society. And if that space tolerates exclusion, then so does the system it represents. Behind him, passengers nodded, some wiping away tears. This is the cabin where we fired a captain, rewrote a manual, built a transparency clause, and gave every voice no matter the side a place at the table. He turned the camera toward Nia Thompson. "This is Nia," he said. "She booked this flight to chase a dream in London. And today, she helped spark a movement." Nia smiled shyly. "I just wanted to be treated fairly," Julian replied. "And now thousands will be, because you stood up." He passed the mic to Captain Renee Walters. "This is what leadership looks like when it's not afraid to start from scratch," he said. She spoke plainly. "We're not flying perfect planes, but we're building a perfect standard together." The stream went viral within minutes. Donors pledged to match Julian's $15 million Pinnacle Sky Trust Fund. Universities requested his speech transcript for ethics curriculums. Advocacy groups asked to join the Passenger Equity Roundtable. Julian ended the stream with one line. "If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, know this you do. And sometimes, the jet you were denied becomes the one you redesign." He tapped end stream. Silence followed. Then applause. Not just from passengers, from the public, watching live in coffee shops, offices, classrooms, and airport lounges. It was no longer just a flight. It was a first step in public reform, and the world had just buckled its seatbelt to join. The wave didn't stop at the edge of the cabin. It didn't land softly with the plane. It rippled through boardrooms, broke through breakroom screens, and shook the polished tables of executive suites across the entire luxury aviation industry. Julian Harris's flight had become more than a story. It was a case study in reform, and the echoes started arriving faster than the ground speed of the Gulfstream G700 itself. Within hours of the live stream ending, news outlets scrambled to update headlines. What began as a niche aviation mishap quickly became a global narrative. Black CEO denied seat, then fires the captain at $36,000 feet. Pinnacle Airlux. CEO executes mid-flight reform while still in the air. Flight becomes turning point for corporate equity standards. The footage of Julian calmly standing in the aisle while announcing the dismissal of Captain Margaret Vaughn went viral on every platform. CNN ran a split-screen segment. Julian's statement on one side, and a panel of aviation experts stunned silent on the other. Forbes published an emergency op-ed, "The New CEO Archetype Quiet, Decisive, Accountable." LinkedIn exploded with praise from DEI professionals, legal experts, and unexpectedly pilots. One post read, "As a commercial airline captain for 14 years, I've never seen a CEO defend passengers in real time. Julian Harris just redefined what accountability looks like at 35,000 feet. Even rival airlines were forced to respond. Altura Private Aviation, a Pinnacle competitor, released a midnight statement. We are reviewing our internal flight protocol policies in response to recent developments at Pinnacle Air Lux. We commend the leadership demonstrated by Mr. Setchos, Harris, and will initiate our own systemic review." Luxair Charter followed with an announcement. Effective immediately, all Luxair flight staff will undergo third-party diversity and bias training. The Pinnacle story reminded us that first class isn't only about luxury, it's about dignity, but it didn't stop at aviation. Hospitality companies, tech firms, private rail services, even luxury cruise lines began re-examining their service hierarchies and gatekeeping mechanisms. Julian didn't speak publicly again that night. He didn't need to. The systems were speaking to each other now. Inside the aircraft, passengers sat in stunned, thoughtful silence, still absorbing what they'd witnessed. No champagne toast, no applause break, just understanding. At seat 3A, Miles Turner stared at the new data portal Evelyn had built updated in real time with incoming pledges, incident reports, and audit requests from other firms. "Sir," Evelyn said through Julian's earpiece, "we've just received 48 requests for consultation from external organizations, everything from airlines to luxury resorts." Julian replied without emotion. "We'll respond, but not as consultants, as collaborators." Grace Patel, seated beside Caleb, looked over the passenger rights draft on her screen. "This is the first time I've written policy where the company didn't ask me to dilute it," she said. Caleb chuckled. "You think this model can scale?" She nodded. "If they're brave enough to let passengers help write it." Julian turned to the group gathered in the aisle. "I don't want this to end with Pinnacle," he said. "This isn't about one airline. It's about every space where power is gatekept and silence is rewarded." He gestured to the front of the plane. "Because when you redesign what's above the clouds, people start to imagine what's possible below them. That very idea sparked a new wave. Media conglomerates began offering Julian speaking opportunities. He declined most of them but authorized one outlet, a quiet but respected public interest docuseries, to shadow the next 90 days of Pinnacle's transformation. Meanwhile, a coalition of 30 CEOs from adjacent industries requested a private summit. Julian's conditions: no scripted statements, no brand optics, no NDAs. "This isn't a brand rescue," he told Evelyn. "It's an ethics relay, and we're just passing the baton." Back in the cabin, Captain Renee Walters made an announcement. "We've just been informed that a group of junior flight officers from competing airlines have drafted an open letter requesting equity mentorship under the Pinnacle model." Applause erupted, not polite, not obligatory. It came from somewhere real. Nia stood again and turned to Julian. "You didn't just change how the industry sees us. You changed how we see ourselves." Julian nodded slowly. No seat, no class, no uniform should ever make a person feel smaller. and today proved that truth travels faster than bias ever could. The cabin fell silent again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because for once, everything had been heard. The reform was underway. The world was watching. But Julian Harris knew every revolution has its final secret. The quiet truth still hiding behind closed cockpit doors. And that secret was about to be exposed. The Gulfstream G700 soared smoothly now. The sky outside streaked in pastels as dusk neared. Inside, calm had returned. But beneath it pulsed something deeper reckoning. Julian sat near the front, reviewing incoming files Evelyn was forwarding from headquarters. Dozens of messages poured in. Complaints, confessions, gratitude. Some were from former employees, some from competitors. But one email stopped him cold. Subject urgent. You need to see this. From Charles Denton. Former Director of Flight Compliance, LuxDirect acquired 2021. Julian opened it. 3 attachments. 1 video. 2 documents. He pressed play. A grainy recording appeared, dated 2023. A closed-door staff briefing led by Margaret Vaughn. "We don't want our elite clients feeling uncomfortable," her voice said sharply. "If someone boards who doesn't look the part, don't wait for security. Redirect. Delay. Displace. Quietly. Efficiently. We want this fleet clean." Someone in the background asked, "What if they're legitimate?" Margaret's answer. Then they'll have the documentation to fight back. And if they don't, problem solved. Julian closed the file, face calm, eyes blazing. He forwarded the video to Evelyn. Verify timestamp, extract all attending staff ID numbers, and cross-reference their current employment status. Her voice came back immediately. Already done. 4 still active. 3 reassigned. 2 were dismissed quietly under the efficiency reorganization last year. Who knew HR Director Carmichael signed off on all disciplinary suppressions? Legal flagged him last quarter. He's still active. Julian stood. He turned to Grace and Caleb. We have it. The seed. The origin point of the pattern. And the executives who preserved it. Grace adjusted her glasses. That's premeditated discrimination. Across departments, Caleb whispered. This isn't just a personnel issue. It's a company legacy rewrite. Julian walked to the center of the cabin. Everyone, he said, projecting his voice gently. We've just uncovered direct footage of the discriminatory model that shaped today's incident and dozens before it. Passengers sat upright. I'm about to show you what built the system we've all just witnessed. He turned the cabin monitor on. Evelyn had already uploaded the clip. They watched Margaret Vaughn, months before the merger, train her team to gatekeep. Not with policy, but with perception. Not with proof, but with prejudice. The final nail was in. When the clip ended, no one moved. Then the older Korean-American man in 5A spoke. She trained them to do it. It wasn't bad behavior, it was doctrine, Nia whispered. And we've been walking into it blind. Julian faced them. This video, this transcript, this evidence will be sent to the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and to every CEO who requested a seat at our reform summit. He paused, but not as retaliation. He turned to Captain Renee Walters. It will be sent as a warning of what happens when power is left to fester in private and no one speaks. Renee stood straighter, and also a standard of what happens when someone does. Miles tapped his laptop. Sir, I found more. The original folder Chloe archived. She never saw the subdirectory. Julian moved beside him. "What's in it?" Miles turned the screen. Dozens of files, each labeled with flight numbers, cabin logs, and a field called Priority Score. "What is that?" Caleb asked. Miles replied. "It's a code, a proprietary ranking system Margaret used. Passengers were graded by a hidden bias index language proficiency, skin tone, attire. She literally gave people a score." Julian closed his eyes, jaw tightening. This is algorithmic discrimination disguised as logistics. Grace stepped forward. "This is grounds for a federal class action lawsuit." Julian turned to Evelyn. "Prepare an immediate legal hold notice. Nothing from the compliance servers gets deleted or transferred. As of now, all records are part of a forensic audit." "Yes, sir. Notices are going out now." Julian faced the passengers. "I didn't know. And that's not an excuse. It's an admission. I thought I'd built a company rooted in excellence, but parts of it were built on silence. We're not going to just fix the damage, we're going to expose its blueprint." The cabin nodded in somber unity. From the back, the Sikh doctor spoke again. "Mr. Harris, what you're doing here, it's not just for the airline. You're giving other industries the courage to open their own books." Julian turned to him. "Then we'll publish our audit in full." Evelyn's voice returned. "Sir, media outlets have requested interviews. Legal confirms that once we land, this flight becomes legal precedent. What you've uncovered is historic." Julian looked out the window again a time. Not at clouds, but at his own reflection in the glass. "This plane never needed to fly to make history," he said softly. "It just needed to reveal it." Behind him, the passengers sat not as bystanders, but as witnesses to the final exposure. And the world was finally watching. The jet hadn't touched the ground, but the storm had passed. Not the media storm that was just beginning, but inside the cabin, where Julian Harris sat quietly in seat 2A, a different kind of stillness had settled. It wasn't the hush of exhaustion, or the pause before applause. It was victory, but one that didn't scream. It breathed. It was the kind of victory that didn't ask for cameras or press conferences. It didn't wave a banner. It didn't chant. It just stood. Captain Renee Walters guided the aircraft with precision, but no fanfare. From the cockpit, her voice came through the intercom, low and respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are 30 minutes from our descent into London. I'd like to thank each of you, not just for your patience, but for your presence. This wasn't just a flight. This was a moment." A few heads nodded. A few eyes watered. But no one clapped. No one needed to. Julian set down his phone. He'd just finished reviewing the final draft of the company-wide message that would reach every Pinnacle employee by morning. Every word had been triple-checked. Not by lawyers, by passengers. He looked across the aisle. Grace Patel was reclined, eyes closed, not asleep, but resting in that rare posture earned only by doing the hard thing and seeing it land. Nearby, Caleb tapped a message to his editor. "Don't cut the quiet parts. That's where the story lives." Behind them, Nia sat alone by the window. She had no notepad, no press release, no agenda, just her hands folded on her lap, a soft expression on her face. Julian stood and walked over. "You're not writing?" he asked gently. She smiled without looking up. "No, for the first time in years. I don't have to explain myself." He sat beside her. "You changed more than you think. I didn't speak with a mic," she said. "You didn't need to." A quiet passed between them, awkward, not heavy, just human. Then Miles stood near the rear and cleared his throat softly. "I've been working on a map," he said to the cabin, "a heat map of bias, based on the logs we recovered. Passengers turned. It's visual," he explained. "You can see the pattern who got downgraded, who was rerouted, who got extra screening. It's all there. And now, it's all transparent." Julian nodded. "Upload it to the Pinnacle Reform Portal. Label it the invisible route." Miles smiled shyly. "It won't be invisible anymore." From the front, Captain Walters emerged again. "Mr. Harris," she said, "before we land, would you like to say anything over the intercom?" Julian considered it, then shook his head. "No." She nodded respectfully, but he stood anyway, facing the cabin one last time. "I don't need a final word," he said, "because you already said everything that needed to be said. In your silence, in your questions, in your willingness to stay aboard, not just the plane, but the process." He looked around. "This is not a press moment. It's a personal one. And if I said anything more, it might drown out what you already know. That was the victory. Not in documents, not in dismissals, but in the simple fact that the people who were once ignored had been seen, heard, and most importantly, believed." From the front row, the older Korean-American businessman spoke softly. "I've flown hundreds of times," he said, "but this is the first time I'll disembark remembering who I sat with, not just where I sat." Nia wiped a tear. Julian nodded, and the aircraft began its descent. Evelyn's voice came softly through his earpiece one last time. "Sir, FAA Oversight just issued a public commendation. They're citing this as a model of non-escalated passenger empowerment and real-time accountability." Julian responded. "File it under team credit. Every seat, every witness. Yes, sir." Down below, Heathrow Airport came into view, glittering under golden dusk light, as the jet glided in, flaps lowering. The passengers didn't prepare their bags. They prepared their hearts, because something had shifted that day more than policies, more than chain of command. Power had turned inward. Grace opened her eyes. Caleb stopped typing. Miles closed his laptop. Nia leaned back, hands still folded, eyes full but peaceful. No one stood. No one cheered. But in that silence, dignity sat down beside every soul in that cabin, and stayed. The wheels touched down at Heathrow with a soft hissa. Gentle return to Earth after a flight that had defied gravity in more ways than one. But the real landing had already happened in people's minds. Julian Harris remained in seat 2A as the Gulfstream G700 taxied to its private gate. There were no flashing cameras on the tarmac, no press waiting with microphones. That wasn't by accident. He had told his team, "No spectacle. This legacy is not built on headlines. It's built on people." Around him, passengers gathered their belongings slowly, not because they were tired, but because no one wanted to be the first to leave. What they had experienced in the air wasn't turbulence, it was transformation. The kind that binds strangers into something closer than team or title, a shared truth. As the door opened, the ground crew welcomed the new pilot captain Renee Walters with subtle nods of respect. She didn't salute or wave. She just walked off the aircraft as the first leader of a new aviation standard. Back in the cabin, Julian stood. He addressed the passengers one final time, not with instruction, but with invitation. "This flight is over," he said, "but the movement just began. I'm not asking you to post about it. I'm not asking you to praise it. I'm asking you to remember it and take it with you into every waiting room, every gate, every boardroom, every classroom, every courtroom. They listened not with awe, but with alignment. Julian continued, "The legacy of this flight won't be my name. It will be yours. The names that were ignored, the names that were erased from manifests, the names that were judged by color, by clothing, by accent." He looked at Naya. Like Thompson, he nodded at Miles. Like Turner, he turned to the Sikh doctor. Like Gill. He finished, voice low but unwavering. "This story won't belong to any one hero, because real reform doesn't. It's always collective." Caleb Grant stepped forward. "Mr. Harris," he said, "I'm publishing the story tonight, but I'm doing it differently. No byline, no feature angle, just raw transcript. The words you all said, the decisions you made. I want the world to read it like a cabin log, not a headline." Julian nodded. "You understand." Grace Patel approached next. "The legal framework is ready," she said. "I'm submitting it for open source release. That way, any airline, hotel, bank, or corporate office can adopt the passenger equity framework we built today." "Thank you," Julian said. "That's how legacy becomes policy." Then Evelyn's voice came softly into his earpiece. "Sir, incoming metrics. Would you like to hear?" He nodded. Pinnacle Sky Trust donations have passed 22 million. The Pinnacle Unity portal has received 10 to 341 grievance submissions in under 6 hours. 12 aviation companies have pledged to adopt the equity clause in their manuals. And FAA just confirmed that your transparency model is being considered as a national training standard. Julian closed his eyes. Not in pride, in peace. The kind of peace that only comes when the work outgrows the worker. He disembarked last, stepping onto the tarmac with no coat, no entourage, and no press badge. Just one man in a linen shirt, walking into the evening like someone who didn't need to be noticed because what he stood for had already been seen. 1 year later, Pinnacle Airlux had changed. 97% employee retention highest in industry history. 127 new pilots from underrepresented backgrounds hired through SkyTrust scholarships. Passenger manifest integrity became a regulation at 3 major airports. A federal task force flight fairness commission was launched based on the audit protocols pioneered on Julian's flight, and that aircraft tail number, PNX 713, never flew the same way again. It became known in private aviation circles as the cabin of change. VIPs requested it by number, not because of leather seats, but because of what had happened inside. Not a scandal, not a protest, a correction. Julian never spoke at summits, never accepted awards. But once a month, he sat in seat 2A with a new passenger beside him as someone who had filed a complaint, shared an idea, or helped shape the policy. He called it legacy rides. And each time, he didn't talk about what happened. He asked them what still needs to. That was his legacy. Not fixing the sky, but teaching us all how to fly through it with integrity. Flight PNX 713 landed, but its story, it stayed in the air. The Gulf Stream. G700 sat idle on the tarmac, cabin doors open to the London night. But inside Julian Harris's mind, the journey hadn't ended. It had only deepened. He stood beside the aircraft, looking not at reporters or flashing bulbs. There were none but at the building across the private runway, Pinnacle's International Operations Office. Clean glass, silent halls. Until now, those walls had housed decisions sealed behind status, rank, and silent prejudice. Not anymore. Inside, a new meeting was beginning. No suits, no ego, just 20 people, engineers, cabin crew, customer care, one single mom from maintenance, one former passenger. This was the new boardroom. Julian entered quietly and sat at the center, not at the head, because legacy, when done right, doesn't sit above, it sits among, across the world. The ripples continued. Airports rewrote deplaning protocols. Hotels redesigned guest intake to account for dignity before data. Trucking firms requested bias audits on hiring. Even a Fortune 50 consulting firm implemented a version of Pinnacle's voice network in their onboarding. Julian watched it all unfold and said very little. Because legacy isn't declared, it's left behind. Weeks after the flight, a letter arrived at Pinnacle HQ. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, just a short, handwritten note. My son watched your cabin speech on his school tablet. He's 10. He stood up during lunch the next day when another kid was being mocked for his accent. The teacher asked him what made him speak up. He said, "Because someone else did it first from a jet." Thank you. Julian read it twice, then folded it gently and placed it inside the very first page of the Pinnacle Unity Handbook, where it remains to this day. Not as decoration, as instruction, because every system, whether in the air or on the ground, one decision away from either protecting power or restoring humanity, and when someone speaks first, others begin to rise. Julian never trademarked the reforms, never monetized the frameworks. He made them open-source public property. He called it altitude ethics, a philosophy, a model, a reminder that flying isn't just about where you go. It's about who you bring with you and how you treat them when they get there. But the most powerful echo came exactly 1 year later. A small aviation school in Georgia reached out. They'd seen the footage, read the policies, adopted the SkyTrust scholarships. They asked Julian to visit, not to speak, just to observe. He sat quietly at the back of a hangar while a young black woman in pilot training performed a flawless takeoff in a test simulator. She wasn't aware he was watching. She didn't need to be. When she landed and stepped out, the instructor asked her what made her want to fly. She answered without pause, "Because I read about a man who was denied a seat and then rebuilt the whole plane." Julian smiled. That was the legacy. Not his name, not his voice, but the thousands now flying in spaces they were once pushed out of. Because someone didn't just take back his seat, he shared it. So, as the final chapter closed on Flight LX-713, what remained wasn't turbulence, or confrontation, or vengeance. What remained was clarity. A clear-eyed understanding that systems don't collapse from outrage alone. They collapse when enough people decide to stop whispering their worth and say it out loud, with calm, with dignity, with evidence. And when the silence lifts, and power is no longer a performance but a platform legacy takes flight. So the next time you step onto a plane, and the attendant scans your ticket, and someone questions where you sit, or who you are, or why you're there, remember this: it's not about claiming a seat, it's about creating a world where no one has to. Because justice doesn't need first class. It just needs room to board. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.